This story isn't about supernatural or unexplainable terrors. It's a story about my encounter with a much more frightening, much more destructive kind of evil. A little info about why I was in this situation. I'm a lifelong fly fisherman, bow hunter, mountaineer, and skier. I grew up in a little town in Colorado. I worked for some backcountry skiing guides and fly shops in high school and through college, and pursued this passion after graduation. I was lucky enough to land a job at an outfitter on the South Island of New Zealand for a couple years, taking wealthy guys stag hunting and trout fishing. I ended up getting hired at an outfitter in Bariloche and headed there to experience a new part of the world. So this experience happened back in April of 2011. We had 2 British clients we were taking on a 3-night backcountry fishing trip by boat around a lake a bit north of Bariloche. It's a big lake with trout and landlocked salmon. A fun place to fish and stunningly beautiful alpine scenery. We met at the fishing shop in Bariloche and piled into our Toyota with our John boat in tow and all our gear loaded on the roof. It was the outfitter's main guide, we'll call him Lewis, the 2 British gents, we'll call them Tom and Mike, and myself, Dave. It took about 4 hours to get up there. We planned to camp on the bank where we'd leave the truck the first night, and set out from there to fish all the inlets and explore the lake for the next 2 days. We pulled into a place on the lake for some fuel, and to take a leak. The clients and Lewis went into the store, and I filled up the rig and some backup tanks we bring on the boat. Right then I noticed a group of guys come out of a little cabin, about 40 meters right behind the station up the hill. They were all white dudes. Not that crazy, but a group of clean gringos this far off the beaten path. Isn't that normal? Unless they're some kind of adventure guides, like us. They were dressed in what looked like outdoorsy gear, cargo pants and boots, and matching little hats. I figured it was a missionary group, or a goofy hiking club or some shit. The last person who walked out of the cabin was a really old-looking gent. He had snow-white skin and hair, and I swear I could see his blue eyes from the truck. What happened next was kind of strange. The 5 or 6 younger men formed a semicircle around the old guy, and he shook each of their hands and whispered a few words to each. Then they would snap to an almost military-like attention when he moved on to the next. When he finished shaking the last guy's hand, he climbed into an old brown Jeep with blue doors and drove up a gnarly 2-track that led up around the lake. When he was out of sight in the trees, the group all piled into a van and drove down to the paved road and back the way we had come. I couldn't help but stare at them as they passed, and all of them were looking at me with sharp eyes. I gave them a smile and waved and turned around. I watched them drive off out of the corner of my eye. Lewis and the clients came out, and we piled in to head to the first camping spot. I didn't say anything about the weird scene, as there wasn't much to say. We had a great first night, got kinda drunk, smoked too many cigarettes, talked American politics. Most of my European clients like to talk about American politics with me, and I like to oblige. Mike was a retired history professor from Essex, and Tom was a retired banker from London. Cool guys, big travelers, and had some experience fly fishing, which makes guide life much easier. We made a big steak dinner and crashed around 9:30. The next morning was cold, wet, and windy as we set off. We had a plan to pin it all the way to the top of the lake, about 14 miles up, and then fish our way back for the rest of the trip. We set up for lunch at the top inlet, and Lewis got the clients fishing. Tom actually landed a decent trout on a dry fly. At this point, it really started sleeting hard, and the wind was singing. Couldn't see the tops of the mountains anymore either. There wasn't any real weather pattern on the Doppler before we left, so we didn't mentally prepare for dealing with these kinds of conditions today. But we always gear up for anything. The banks were too steep to set up the rain tarp where we were, so we piled into the boat to cross the lake to the opposite shoreline, which was flat and forested. About 6 or 7 minutes in, the weather got really pissed, and the lake got way too choppy for our John boat. There's a point at which you abandon your adventure guide positivity and just get your clients to safety. I was on the bow and glanced back at Lewis, who had a "fuck this" look on his face. Tom finally yelled at us, "Jesus, guys, let's get off the water now." We already knew this, of course, but it was a really sketchy situation. A moment later, Mike yelled, pointing at about 3 o'clock off the bow, "Lights, right there! There's a cabin, look!" There weren't supposed to be any residences up here, but set back in the forest above the lake, there were 2 lights that looked like glowing cabin windows, so Lewis cranked us toward the steep bank. I hopped off first to get the tie line out and to help the guys out of the boat. The bank was really sharp, and I had to scramble up the embankment to tie off onto a tree root. Lewis yelled up to me, "Dave, go see what that place is. Maybe we can hunker down until the storm passes. I'll get these guys some ponchos and get the cover on the boat." It was a short walk into the woods after climbing the bank, but the trees were bending and whining in the wind so freakishly I thought they were going to break. The sleet was stinging my face. It was gnarly, but I was glad we were off the water. I could see the cabin now in the trees. It was the back of it, with a little porch, and looked like something from where I grew up. Simple little log cabin with a stone chimney, and the Jeep. The fucking Jeep that the old weird guy had taken off in at the gas station. It was parked in a little carport. I put my head down and booked it to the side of the house to get to the front door. When I was getting pretty close to the cabin, I felt like I was going to run into something. So I looked up, and will never forget this moment for the rest of my life. It was him, the old white-haired man, 10 feet in front of me, eyes bluer than any I'd ever seen. He was wearing wool pants, tucked into tall riding boots, a gray shirt, a wool vest, that same little hat, and more importantly, he was pointing a bolt-action rifle at my chest. I shot my hands up and said in Spanish, "I'm sorry, sir, I'm a fishing guide, and we got stuck in the storm, and I was going to see who was home. I can just leave. I can just leave." He had a frighteningly calm, dark expression, and looked like he had to be 90 years old, but also looked like he was in good shape for his age. His knuckles were white around the gun. He was slowly pacing forward, and I was slowly backing up, shaking and repeating, "I can just leave." Then he grinned. This man grinned the single creepiest smile I had ever seen, exposing a mouthful of golden teeth, and had pure evil in his eyes. I can't explain this, but I wanted him to either shoot me or just stop smiling so I didn't have to see it anymore. I then looked up at his hat-covered forehead so I didn't have to look into his eyes any longer, or at that rifle that was about to blast a hole through my chest, and I saw a metal pendant. It had an iron eagle above 2 lightning bolts. Then he spoke in a deep, sharp voice, while gesturing with his hawkish nose at the lake.
"Gehen Sie ertrinken am See, Junge."
I figured this was the time to make a move and bolted. I sprinted to the steep bank as fast as I could, jumped down to the boat, and saw Lewis had the guys under an overhanging bank, a few meters away. I screamed at them to get in. Lewis said, "What the hell is going on?" I was really scared and snarled back, "There's a fucking guy with a fucking rifle coming. Let's go now." Tom and Mike jumped right in, and Lewis was moving slower. Lewis, a guy at the cabin, pointed a gun at me and said to leave. "Let's fucking go now." I ran the motor while we scuttled along the shoreline all the way back to the truck. But on that long, bumpy, freezing boat ride back, once I calmed down a bit, I told the story word for word. Mike asked me to repeat what the man had said several times. And then he said, "That's German, David. It means go drown in the lake, boy." And that sounds exactly like a Nazi SS medal. Mike went on to tell us about a lot of Nazi criminals that escaped by making it to Argentina. Many of them hadn't ever been seen again. We made it back into Bariloche after a sleepless night in the tent and refunded their money. I actually moved back to the States a little under a month later. However, the old Nazi didn't scare me off by himself. I left Argentina because something else scared me. About 2 weeks later, I was walking to the fly fishing shop I hung out at, and I saw 3 guys walking toward me. Tall, white dudes. They stopped and blocked the sidewalk. I had to veer into the street to pass them. I looked up. They were some of the guys I saw meeting with the old man the day of our trip. I felt my stomach drop. The closest one to me looked about 40, with graying blonde hair and the same piercing blue eyes the old Nazi had. As I was walking by, he said, smiling in a broken English, "You should have drowned in the lake, boy." This happened years ago. Me and two friends, we'll call them Dan and John, decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere, on Victoria Island, BC. We knew of an old logging road that went for miles and led to a lake. The lake was unnamed because of the absolute level of isolation it provided. It was a 3-hour drive from the house. We planned on driving out there and sleeping overnight in my '79 Jeep Wagoneer. We brought food, water, fishing gear, a first aid kit, sleeping bags, and also my double-barrel 12-gauge. I'm not a hunter, but in BC, wildlife can be dangerous, so I always bring a gun. We arrived at the lake at about 1 p.m. and set up our campsite. The plan was to catch fish and cook them for dinner, but we also brought lots of other food in case we didn't catch anything. After getting set up and settled in, we went fishing off the shore. We didn't catch anything, so we resorted to eating store food for dinner. After hours of drinking, talking, and not catching fish, it started to rain. It was probably 7 p.m. when the downpour and lightning started. We decided to just stay in the Jeep and play cards. John was in the back, while Dan and I were in the front. It wasn't easy to do. Dan kept getting mad at John for apparently seeing his cards from the rearview mirror, which was pretty funny. After a few hours of this, I realized that the road will be an absolute quagmire with all the rain, and as good as the Jeep is at off-roading, there would be no way to get through without waiting for it to dry some. No way to get out of here if there were an emergency. It was really late now, probably 11 or 12, and the rain and thunder was not letting up. We just decided to go to sleep. The front seats reclined, and the back worked as a bed. This is where stuff started to get scary. A couple of hours after we went to bed, something happened outside. The rain had slowed down a bit, and what we heard woke us up and terrified us. We heard loud, heavy footsteps circling the Jeep. Immediately we all froze in fear, and I slowly grabbed and loaded the gun. We could not see outside because of how pitch black the night was. It was like being blind. We heard the footsteps loudly pacing around outside the Jeep for what seemed like forever. John wanted me to turn on the headlights to see what it was. Dan was too petrified to whisper, as was I. Whatever it was very big, and not a bear because it sounded like it was always on 2 feet. We decided to turn on the lights because we needed to scare it away. But in reality, I don't think any of us thought that it would be scared of anything we did. I turned on the headlights and saw nothing but the campsite and the lake beyond. I decided to put the Jeep in reverse to illuminate the reverse lights, which were surprisingly bright. What we saw scared us even more than we thought was possible. 2 glowing eyes, just beyond the reach of the light, and at least 7 or 8 feet from the ground. I just stared, too scared to look away. Even though I was holding a shotgun, I was too scared to move. The eyes vanished and the footsteps were heard again, but they were getting quieter. Relief for the first time. We waited until sunrise, gun in hand and terrified. When we got out, we saw fresh, huge footprints in the mud surrounding the Jeep and all over the site. It was the most surreal and terrifying experience in my life, and we knew that whatever made those prints was still out here somewhere. Once we were packed up, we drove out. The road was very muddy, and the Jeep had to be in 4 low the whole way. We drove for about 20 minutes down the bog of a road and came across a fallen tree. We collectively yelled in frustration and fear when we saw it, and we were forced to get out. I had the gun in my hands the whole time, as they chained the tree to the Jeep and pulled it just enough to the side to get by. We agreed to not tell anyone of our encounter with whatever the hell that was. The week after my friends and I graduated high school, we were graduation party hopping and decided to call it a night. One of the girls' parents were out of town, so we went to her house and my friends had a few drinks. I was driving them home, so I abstained, which I was very grateful for later. This house was in a fairly rural area, about a 2-minute walk from a medium-sized lake, with a small beach and several houses around it. We grew up and felt comfortable here, so after a while the girls said they wanted to go jump in the lake. It was 1 a.m. and I was completely sober, so I said I would accompany them but stay on the beach. I'm not a strong swimmer, and I have a fear of dark water. At the beach there was absolutely no light, no street lights, and all house lights around the lake were off. We could barely see our hands in front of our faces, but I sat on the small dock, about 10 feet long, while the girls stripped down to their underwear and swam out to a small raft, anchored about 50 feet from the shore. We were talking back and forth and laughing, when suddenly, a back porch light on the opposite side of the lake turned on. Very clearly, I saw the silhouette of a man in a canoe, about 3 feet away from the raft, and getting closer. One of the other girls saw it too, and started screaming to get back to shore. The light turned off, they all jumped in the water, and I made myself wait somehow till they all got back to shore, before running back to the house faster than I ever have. The girls left their clothes on the beach, so they borrowed some, and I drove them all home after we stopped being hysterical. The girl who lived there stayed with someone else that night, instead of sleeping in an empty house. I'm so glad that light turned on, and I don't want to know what would have happened if it didn't. This story takes place about 6 years ago. At that time I played a lot of tennis together with my mom and dad. Our family was well known around the court, and it was a typical case of everyone knows everyone. I made a lot of friends there, and in particular with one boy the same age as me. We will call him Dan for the sake of the story. We quickly became close friends and hung out at each other's houses a lot. He lived in another village, so his mom would drop him off at my house, and my mom would drop me off at his house. Dan also had a little brother, Mike, that was only 2 years younger, and we all got along great, except for the occasional brotherly fights between them. One day, Dan and I got the idea to go fishing. I hadn't fished a lot, only 3 times with my grandfather. Dan, however, often went fishing and had a spare rod I could use. He also knew a great spot nearby, so we headed out on our bikes. We cycled for about 20 minutes until we came up to a small farm that was at the edge of the forest. Dan explained to me that his grandparents lived in the house, so we parked our bikes and went inside for a glass of lemonade, and Dan introduced me to his grandparents, who seemed very sweet. His grandmother even gave us a slice of pie, and Dan explained that we would go fishing at the lake. After we ate the pie, we left, and I followed Dan toward the forest. As we walked away, his grandfather opened the window and told Dan, "Remember to respect the fish and the water." Dan gave a thumbs up as a sign that he heard his grandfather, and as soon as we went out of earshot, I asked him what his grandfather meant by that. He shrugged his shoulders and told me he never paid a lot of attention to it, and that his guess was that it was his grandfather's way of telling him to respect nature. After walking a short while, we reached the lake. It wasn't anything special. I think it was about 1.5 football fields in width and length. The only thing at the moment that struck me as odd was that the shore wasn't very wide, maybe 3 or 4 feet max, before the trees formed a nearly impenetrable border. The only way to get to the lake was through 2 very small human-made paths. Dan told me not a lot of people knew about this lake. We walked into a very small bay-like area, where some rotten wood was sticking out of the water, where there obviously used to be a jetty. We both casted out our rods, and throughout the day had a great time sitting in the sun, just cracking jokes, and him teaching me how to remove hooks and all other sorts of fishing stuff. To make a long story short, it was the perfect summer day, and we decided to do the same tomorrow. We went fishing the 2 days after that, and nothing ever seemed weird, except for the silence. When we didn't talk, it was so serene. There was no sound at all. like the entire lake was cut off from the world and sound didn't exist in this realm. Now that I think about it, it creeps me the fuck out, but at the moment I just enjoyed the peace and quiet. The third day we decided we should have a marathon session. We would set up a tent at the edge of the water, bring plenty of food and drinks, and some firewood to keep us warm. My mother dropped me off early in the morning at Dan's house, and we instantly rode to the lake. There was a lot of morning fog hanging over the water. We walked over to the bay area and set up our tent, when all of a sudden we heard splashing. It startled us. It sounded like a dog thrashing in the water, swimming towards us. We both looked at each other and back at the lake. However, it had stopped as soon as it had started. The entire day passed with us just talking about everything from girls to games to school, and of course making wise-ass comments to each other. Soon the sun started to set and we got a fire going pretty fast. As the flames rose, we felt a chilling gust of wind pass over, giving us both goosebumps. We sat down in our sleeping bags near the campfire. I don't know how much time passed, but at some point I fell asleep. I was woken up by hearing thrashing in the water again, only this time closer to the shore. It scared me enough to wake me up instantly. I saw the campfire was still burning, and I whispered, "Did you hear that?" After I got no reply for 10 seconds, I looked over to see if Dan also had fallen asleep. However, he was nowhere to be found. I got a bit anxious and called his name out. No response. I called his name again, only louder this time, as panic started to fill me. Again, nothing. Now I noticed that the thrashing was coming closer, and panic transformed into fear. I jumped up and stood as close to the fire as I could, my eyes fixed on the water, but it was pitch black and hard to make anything out. Then, silence. It stopped. I looked back at the water, and all of a sudden I saw something. There was a head poking out, but all I saw was the bridge of its nose and its eyes and hair. It was human, but the eyes, they stared through me. They were like dark yellow, and the rest of the figure seemed pitch black. But there was something familiar in those eyes, and then it struck me. It was Dan, but at the same time it wasn't. I ran away. I don't know why, but I ran into the forest as hard as I could, leaving the fire. I could hear thrashing in the water again, this time more aggressive, like something was rushing to the shore trying to get me. I ran the only place I knew where to run to, his grandparents. I got there within 5 minutes. I started banging on the door while crying like a 4-year-old. After what seemed like ages, his grandfather opened the door and looked at me with mixed emotions. He was sleepy, annoyed, and surprised. All I could get out between sobs was, "Dan's in the lake." His eyes grew big as he ran back inside, and not a minute later came out with a flashlight and a hunting rifle, and told me to follow him as he bolted towards the forest. When we got there, he told me to stay in the woods, and if he fell into the water, to run back and get his wife. He slowly went towards our tent, and then I saw it. Our campsite was ruined. It looked like some people camped there 1 year ago, not 10 minutes ago. It looked decayed, broken, old, like someone set up camp, and then the following day left and didn't bother cleaning it up. I could only see the silhouette of Dan's grandfather. I heard him thrashing through the water, cursing and shouting Dan's name. And after a while he came back, Dan over his shoulder, unconscious, or so it seemed to me. We walked home in silence and they laid me on the couch and told me to sleep and don't worry about Dan, he would be okay. When I woke up, his grandfather brought me home. I didn't even see Dan. He said that he had gotten sick from the water and was sleeping in his grandparents' bed. I didn't really believe him. Dan and I grew apart after this, until we lost contact with each other completely. I've kept silent about this to this day, because I don't really know what happened. It all seemed too surreal. I'm only telling this story now, because I got an email today that said, "Hey, wanna go fishing again?" Attached was a photo of the lake. It all started with broke and job-hungry me. I'm running around everywhere looking for work. I can do most tasks put before me. As I'm talking to the manager of a grocery store, a strange-looking middle-aged man approaches me. He says, "Son, you looking for a bit of work?" I reply with a swift, "Yes, sir." He gives me his number and tells me to call him later that night. A few hours later, I gave him a call. He picks up the phone and I tell him who I am. He says, right. Basically what I need done is for someone to clean up my land around my cabin. There's piles of old scrap metal, junk, and God knows what else laying around. Also, there may be a few downed trees, so I hope you know how to work a chainsaw. As for payment, I've got that covered. He goes on to list how much I will receive for a week's worth of work, and the address. The whole time he was explaining different things, directions and equipment and such. He sounded very jumpy. The last thing he tells me is, also, it's in the middle of the bush with one neighboring cabin. Please stay away from it. I was told I could use all the utilities, stay inside of the cabin, and where the key was hidden. I know, you're probably thinking, why in the fuck would you accept something like that? He offered a ridiculous amount of cash and I couldn't pass it up. I packed up some of my belongings, food and drinks, and my 2 dogs. We set off up north for a long drive. After 5 or 6 hours of driving, and another hour going down a dirt road full of potholes, I'm at the road which branches off to the 2 cabins. I got my first good look at them both. Both were empty, no vehicles parked in front of either. I let out a sigh of relief, and proceeded to park in the driveway of the old man's cabin. I stepped out of my truck, and a freezing wind flew through me, but the trees were still. I brushed it off because it's the north. Obviously, it's going to be a bit chilly. I began to survey the land, seeing what I had to do. Shit, there's crap everywhere, and plenty of trees are snapped, cracked, and busted. Wonderful. I walk around the back and see that a whole bunch of trees are down, and there's a beautiful lake which I wasn't informed of. I also noticed 2 fishing boats on the lake, having a blast slaying fish. Maybe this won't be so bad after all. How wrong I was. The 2 fishing boats left that night. I was alone in the middle of the bush. The nearest city is 2 hours away. No cell service. I started off with some basic cleanup until the sun went down. The first night was amazing. I had a great sleep, listening to the wind rip through the trees. The next day, shit started to get weird. My dogs were acting up, barking at thin air. I assumed they were just chasing some squirrels. 2 trees bucked up later, and a few hours of weed whacking and raking. It's approaching night again. I raked over a small pile of dirt, and was too lazy to see what was under it because it was getting dark and I was exhausted. This was my mistake. Later that night, I'm closing my eyes about to sleep and I hear it. The most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. The dogs freaked out. I was shitting my pants and violently shaking. A proper man would have gone out there. I was frozen in my sleeping bag. I could not move. I sat there all night till I could see the morning glow through the windows. Nothing else happened. In the morning of the 3rd day, I cooked up some eggs and got ready for another day of work. First thing on the list, break the owner's rule and check out the sketchy cabin. I just walked around it and every hair was standing straight up. I could feel eyes shooting daggers into me. I turned quickly and looked up into the window. I froze. All I saw was a headless body. My dogs sensed something as well. They were both barking and running around the sketchy cabin. I finally broke out of it and ran back to the old man's. I drank it off. No work was done that day. As night fell, it only got worse. Weird tapping noises started. I could hear whispers. I was never able to make out what was being said. I don't even know why I laid down. I knew I wasn't going to be able to sleep. That's when it happened again. This time much closer than the last. A scream, ripping through the forest and my window. This was not the only one. Each scream was roughly 10 to 20 minutes apart, and each one closer than the last. I'm having a panic attack, glued into my sleeping bag. The dogs are pacing and restless. The screams were so close, creeping slowly to my cabin. I counted the minutes and prepared for the next one. It didn't happen. I sat in terror for 2 hours. Then a voice, a woman's hissing voice. Return what was once before, or you will die. Then everything stopped. Again, I didn't move a muscle all night. Morning came. Right away, I took my dogs out and looked around. I noticed the pile of dirt I raked. It was on the sketchy cabin's property. I almost broke down in fear when I saw it. I had raked over a human skull. Shit. Without looking behind me at the cabin, I carefully placed the skull back in the dirt and covered it up. Then I had a weird feeling. Oh my God, she's behind me. I whip around expecting her. Nothing. I felt the atmosphere change immediately, like popping your ears after a long trip. I packed all my stuff and my 2 dogs and started to drive out. I've had it with this place. As I'm driving out, I sneak a peek at the sketchy cabin. There she was in the front window, this time with long brown hair, black eyes, and a grimacing smile. Those few days have scarred my life. A few weeks later, I received a phone call. Well, son, you didn't do too bad of a job. I won't come after my money for a refund, but I felt like you could have done more. I said, sir, I will give you back your money. I had to leave early. The last words I heard from this man were, ah, you saw her, didn't you? Keep the money, son. I understand. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. I would have had a video out sooner, but I got sick as shit. In fact, here's an audio clip of the sickness in my body last week.
How's everybody doing tonight? Yeah, baby! Okay, here we go.
Be good to animals, even people. So.
Skjál, Snemar, Bjarksbus, Hrish.
Whoa.